A strong phenomenon over the last generation has been an increase in the number of young people involved in different approaches to politics. A generation ago, most students identified as some sort of conservative / Republican or some sort of liberal / Democrat. But there is very few libertarians or socialists among the student population. And so one of the fascinating things about our generation is how, of course, there are still lots of conservative Republicans, liberal Democrats, but also a large contingent of libertarian students and large contingents of socialist students. And of course, the surveys show there's a strong uptick in the number of students who are strongly interested in socialism. And this is often surprising to us in this generation because a generation ago, we were optimistically hoping that we had won that battle. The Cold War was ending. Soviet Union was collapsing. Communist China was perhaps reforming in some ways and liberalizing. The Eastern European countries had been liberated. Earlier, the disasters of National Socialism had also been defeated, as well as Italian socialism under the fascists and so forth. So to some extent, it's disheartening to see a resurgence in socialism among young people. And this, of course, contributes to the polarization in social discourse that many people are worried about. Now, I share some people's concerns about the polarization, but I also think that much of the polarization is a healthy development. And it's a healthy because some of the dimensions of polarization mean that people are getting away from a generation ago's thinking of the political spectrum in terms of a simple left versus right. They have some sort of a package of beliefs that we would variously call conservative / Republican, and they may or may not be internally consistent, but more likely they are a big tent, often inconsistent grab bag of positions that have evolved for practical politics reasons as much as principle. And then the same thing on the other side with a liberal Democrat big tent package of positions that are not necessarily internally consistent. So the polarization in part, I think, involves some intellectual health in that a large number of people of this generation, younger people, are realizing that there really are other dimensions out there. It's not just that simple duality that, in fact, I could be a socialist, I could be a conservative, I could be a welfare state liberal or civil libertarian, but I also could be a libertarian. And they're aware that there are 4 alternatives rather than just 2. And I think that's useful for clarifying the landscape of options. It also means, and this does contribute to the polarization, but in a healthy way, that as people become aware of the alternatives and what differentiates them, they are thinking more in terms of principles, right? And so part of the polarization then is people saying, well, look, if we take liberty as a principle and push it, then of course we have to reject strong elements of conservatism and strong elements of the liberal democratic package. And of course, if we push for communalism or we push strongly on principle for some sort of equality or egalitarianism, then we're going to end up in some sort of socialist part of the terrain as well. And I think that's healthier because then, at least from a philosophical standpoint, which of course as a philosopher I think is the best one, it means that people are thinking in terms of principle instead of just accepting packages of beliefs as they happen to exist in contemporary society. But from my strategic thinking perspective, when I take my philosophy and I understand the alternatives that are out there, and I want to argue with, and I want to argue convincingly with people who I think are on the wrong side of various positions, this then means thinking about the larger number of young people who are attracted to socialism, as the surveys show, and thinking what kinds of arguments are going to work with them. And I think in many cases, people who are not socialists, they can come from any number of the parts of the political spectrum, libertarians, conservatives, and then more centrist Democrats. The kinds of arguments that they typically make, I think, are not effective. And in some sense, they are fighting last generation's intellectual battle. So, for example, someone expresses a favorable view of socialism, whatever that is, then people who are not socialists will then typically make one of three kinds of responses, right? The first kind of response will be to say, look, hey, there's the Soviet Union. That was a big experiment in a kind of socialism, and China, right? So we have to talk about Stalin, we have to talk about Mao, and we have to talk about what disasters they were, and that doesn't work, right? The young person just kind of their eyes glaze over. Of course, they've heard of the Soviet Union and China, Stalin and Mao, but the argument doesn't connect with them. There's a question then about why that is. So that's one issue. The second kind of thing that people who are not socialists will respond is by saying, well, hey, let's talk about some economics, and they will then immediately whip out some data, start quoting some statistics, say, look at this chart with these numbers. Clearly, socialism doesn't work economically, and look at the non-socialist nations of the world. They're performing along these various economic measures a whole lot better. And again, with younger socialists, that also seems relatively impactless, and the argument on the grounds of economic efficiency doesn't get some traction with them. A third kind of counter-argument to expressions of socialism is not necessarily economic, not necessarily directly historical about Soviet Union and China, but involves more contemporary examples, right? The anti-socialist will say, hey, well, what about Venezuela, right? What about North Korea? What about what's going on in Cuba? And they will point to various disaster examples of socialism going on right now in the contemporary world. And again, the younger socialist may have heard something about Venezuela or North Korea and have some views on Cuba, but the counter-argument based on those examples doesn't seem, again, to make traction. Now, I've noticed this quite a lot, in my classes and following the literature and what goes on among student groups and so on. I see the counter-arguments being made, but I also see the younger socialists just shrugging them off, because it seems like what is on their mind, what's attracting socialism to them, is quite different. And so those arguments don't have any traction at all. Now, why they don't have traction, I think, is for a series of reasons, different in each case. So the Soviet Union and China. Now, those are absolutely important arguments to make, but not for younger students, at least not first. They have to be motivated. Those are historical arguments, right, about stuff that was going on 2 generations ago for most younger socialists, and the same thing for communist China and Cambodia and Vietnam and so on. And, of course, we can bemoan the state of history education among young people these days and get all curmudgeonly right and so forth. But the study of history does have to be motivated, right, for a young person to say, okay, I'm going to make a serious study of the Soviet Union and China and so forth. They have to think that is relevant to what they think socialism is. And so the question then is going to be, if that meant some sort of Marxist revolutionary socialism, central planning of the government, or some sort of belief in Maoist Leninism and so on, most young socialists, to the extent that they understand those phenomena, they will say sincerely, that's not the kind of socialism that I am talking about. So those may be various kinds of socialism, or maybe they weren't real socialism, but they're not speaking to what the young people themselves understand by socialism. The economic data arguments, I think, are different here. Again, the study of economics needs to be motivated. You do have to think that economic matters are central, and if you think that free market economics versus some kind of central planning, socialism is the central debate, and so then you want to compare nations in terms of their economic performance and what the data says about those two comparative systems. The presupposition is that the young person who's attracted to socialism is coming to it by thinking in terms of what is going to maximize economic performance. And again, I don't think that is true of younger socialists. My understanding, my sense for younger socialists is, of course, they think money matters, and of course they think economic matters, but they are willing to trade off on economic performance, and they have other reasons or other values more than just economic wealth and economic productivity for favoring socialism.
In Stephen Hicks's book, Explaining Postmodernism, Skepticism and Socialism from Rousseau to Foucault, he writes an incredibly crafted and well-argued insight into what postmodernism is, why it exists, and why it is dangerous applied in the wrong dose, in the wrong place, as it frequently is in this day and age. Postmodernism has been the most vigorous intellectual movement of the late 20th century. In his book, Hicks traces the roots of postmodernism all the way back to the Enlightenment era, where he systematically charts how the age of reason sowed the seeds of unreason that was to follow, making a clear connection between postmodernism to history, leftist politics, and even the ugliness of contemporary art. Hicks presents his thesis with beautiful, easy-to-understand explanations that burn with logic and common sense. So if you've ever wondered why society holds so many assumptions about the world, and you want to understand the chaos of what is happening, Hicks's work in this book provides a huge piece to this puzzle. Why do skeptical and relativistic arguments have such power in the contemporary intellectual world? Why do they have that power in the humanities but not in the sciences? Why is a significant portion of the political left the same left that traditionally promoted reason, science, equality for all, and optimism now switch to the themes of anti-reason, anti-science, double standards and cynicism? This book is by far the most helpful resource I've ever come across for understanding why the world is turning into a direction that I just can't comprehend. Pick up your copy of Stephen Hicks's book, Explaining Postmodernism, Skepticism, and Socialism from Rousseau to Foucault, available now on Amazon.com. While you're online, make sure to subscribe to the Open College podcast, hosted by Stephen Hicks himself, and please leave a review for it on iTunes or Stitcher. Now back to the podcast.
And then as for the third kind of argument that anti-socialists will typically come out with as soon as someone expresses some interest in socialism, mentioning what's going on in Venezuela, perhaps in Cuba or in North Korea, and other places where socialism has been tried and is being tried currently. Again, those kinds of examples don't seem to make an impact. And here my sense is that, again, we can complain about geography lessons and how little students know about world geography and where places are. But again, that speaks to the point that to think about all of these foreign countries and the experiments that are going on there currently, it has to be that young people are coming to their socialism by a study of what's going on in current socialist experiments. And the ones that are currently going on in North Korea and in Venezuela, aside from the issue of many of them not knowing particularly where they are, well, the sense I get there is that those get dismissed fairly quickly by young socialists because they have a view that those are in less civilized parts of the world or semi-civilized parts of the world. I don't really think there's a racist issue that those are brown people or those are yellow people and they're not going to do it as well. I'm not picking up on any of that in the young socialists that I am reading or talking with. But I do have the sense that they, particularly the ones in North America, whom I'm most familiar with in the United States and Canada, they realize that they are in one of the advanced civilizations of the world, one of the places where there's a lot of culture and manners and so forth. And being advanced and civilized, they have a sense that, if there's a kind of socialism going on in these second or third world or distant places in the world, and they screw it up, well, that's not really going to be a black mark against the socialism that I think we should be able to accomplish, given that we are in an advanced, civilized part of the world. So the point of all of this is that I don't think the standard responses or the most common responses to expressions of socialism are meeting their mark rhetorically. And for them to meet their mark rhetorically, we have to understand where young socialists are in their thinking, what socialism means to them, what values they think it is advocating. And so when we identify what those are, then we can come up with an argumentative strategy and a rhetorical strategy that will speak to them instead of the dismissive response or the talking past that goes on. So what I want to do now is think of the remainder of this podcast as a research and strategy session. And I want you, the listener, to be part of the research and strategizing. So what I want to ask you to do is listening along, if you have good memory, but it might actually help if you have some paper and pen handy. And I'm going to give you some questions, and I'm going to run through some arguments for certain kinds of socialism. Just make a quick note of what the questions are and the arguments so that we can refer back to them a little bit later in the podcast. And then in the next podcast in this series, I'm going to follow up and offer my own accounts of where I think young socialists are coming from and what I think the arguments are that are strong for them, or the considerations that are strong for them, and what I think good responses will be. So what I want you to do is to try to put yourself in the mind of a young socialist. Actually, maybe you are a young socialist, and so that's easy for you to do. But maybe you are a liberal, or you're a conservative, or you're a libertarian, and you're already opposed to socialism. So step outside of your framework and try to put yourself in the mindset of what you take a socialist to be. And let's focus on the younger demographic, so some late teens, early 20s age person, so old enough to be an adult, but a young adult who is thinking seriously about world issues. So the first question I'm going to have is, if you could formulate, either in your mind or on paper, what does socialism mean to you? How would you define socialism? Or how would you at least describe socialism in one sentence? All right, now that's a hard exercise, but I think it's one that is worth going through. Because if your non-thought experiment socialist position is very different from, you say, this is what socialism means to me, but you're talking to a young person who has a very different understanding of what socialism is, obviously the conversation is going to go nowhere. So what does socialism mean to the young socialist? A second and closely related question, but this is a normative question or an evaluative question, would be, what is appealing about socialism to you? Another way to formulate that question, what value, top value, or important values do you think socialism is going to bring about? What makes it good, noble, preferable, the best, whatever evaluative term you want to think of. So what's the attraction of socialism to you? Now, that said, what I want next to do is run through what I think are a number of arguments and considerations or framings of socialism and its values that I see current in my discussions and readings with younger socialists. And so I want to run through them and just present them. I'll spend maybe a minute, maybe 2 minutes on each one, and I'll give them a label. Now, just as a heads up, I've got 8 of them. So if you have an outstanding memory and you can remember all 8 of them, that's fine. If you are using pen and paper or pencil and paper, prepare to have an 8-point list. And I'll give you the argument and then a shorthand labeling tag for each of them. All right, so let's start with number 1. So what does socialism mean to you? Well, if I put myself in the shoes of a young socialist, what socialism means primarily to me is being opposed to the current system and being opposed especially to all of the corruption that goes on in the current system. And my thinking is going to be, this is what I've been taught, that we live in what is basically a capitalistic economic system. Free markets, make a lot of money, and so forth. And that has led to a huge amount of corruption. Lots of cheating that goes on in business, lots of underhanded dealings, lots of people who are rich turning their riches into political influence and corrupting the political process. So we talk about cronyism, but in my view, since we live in a dominantly capitalist system, cronyism is the fault of all of the money, all of the rich connected capitalists, and of course the politicians who are in bed with them. Money and power are an unholy mix. And so cronyism is either a necessary result or an unintended consequence of the current capitalist system. And I think that's just wrong, right? Corruption is an injustice. It's immoral, and it goes on so much. I am just disgusted and offended by it, by a young person. And socialism promises to take on that unholy, illegitimate use of wealth to buy political influence. So I'm in favor of socialism because I'm opposed to the corruption of capitalism. All right, that's number 1. So let's call that anti-cronyist socialism. 2, a second one. What socialism means to me is a moral idealism and a morally ideal person or a person who is striving for that is going to see himself or herself as serving society, as putting the needs of other people before his or her own. What it is to be a good person is not to be selfish, to think about other people and to put other people first. It really does mean being selfless in the first sense. It's not that you can't have any concern at all for yourself, but the self is of less. We're part of society, and my moral obligations or my moral commitments as a benevolent person would be toward other people. And so socialism, as the name says, is about putting society first. And that's what morality teaches us. It's about putting other people's needs, putting society's needs above your own. So that's number 2, and I'm going to call that altruistic socialism. And so altruistic socialism is taking altruism as a moral ideal and wanting to apply it politically consistently. Third, socialism is about centralized management of the economy. And I think that the centralized management of the economy is good because it is modern and it is scientific. The economy is important, and we know a lot about the economy. We have a lot of very smart, very well-educated people who know a lot more than the average person in the street about what's good for business and the economy. And so as a result, as modern and scientific and forward-thinking people, we should not be leaving economic decisions and business decisions to the anarchy of the free market. If you just leave people free to make whatever decisions they want about what they're going to make and what they're going to buy, well, that's just going to lead to chaos and inefficiencies. It's going to lead to lots of stupid stuff being made, and of course we can just go into any big store. In capitalism, we see all kinds of ridiculous products that are being made, and people making all sorts of stupid decisions as consumers, right? They buy all sorts of stuff that they don't really need. So what we can and should do as progressive thinking, using the best tools of technology, computers, economic modeling, and having smart people in charge of things, is they will do a better job of managing the economy. All right, that's number 3. And among young socialists who know, particularly university socialists, that they are smarter than the average person, and they really are informed, they think they will be informed, this more technological, smart person, central planning seems like, why not? Let's take on the challenge. It's got to be better than the average and below average people making decision and the anarchy of the free market. So number 3 is central planning socialism.
We all know what true crime is, but what about untrue crime? The true stories of innocent people whose lives have been ripped apart and who have not been allowed to tell their stories until now. Listen to Untrue Crime on the Possibly Correct Network as Diana Davison sheds light onto cases where reputations have been ruined, careers have been destroyed, and countless lies have been told. Find out what really happens when the finger of blame points to someone who's innocent. Subscribe to the Untrue Crime Podcast by going to www.untruecrimepodcast.com and follow the show on Facebook, Minds.com and Gab for all the latest news and releases. You can check out all of our podcasts by following Possibly Correct on Minds.com.
All right, number 4 is a less principled approach to socialism, and I'm going to call it free stuff socialism. The idea here is that I am not necessarily attracted to socialism as a big abstract principled thing that I've got this vision of service to society as a whole or central planning of the economy, but rather if socialism is pitched to me in a piecemeal way, then I find myself nodding and coming to agreement. And so it's a gradualist approach. So if you tell me I'm a young person, do I think that healthcare should be free? Then I'm going to say, well, yeah, of course, that sounds like a very nice thing to do. The government should provide people's health care or health insurance. Or do I think that there should be government-run public transportation so that everybody can efficiently get around and people who can't afford it can get around. Well, I'll say, yeah, of course there should be free transportation. Do I think that college education should be free to young people, just like high school and primary school is free? Education is important. Should education be made available to everyone? Well, I'm going to say, yeah, of course, I'm in favor of to that. So what we then have is a gradualist approach. Yes, I'm in favor of socialism in education. I'm in favor of it in transportation. I'm in favor of it in healthcare. And so I end up kind of in default generally agreeing with the socialist position. And I also kind of like the idea that if I ever got in trouble economically, that I'm going to be looked after. There's welfare state, that someone is looking after my pension and my retirement should I end up old and poor. I like the idea that the government is looking after myself and other people who might be in similar situations and so on. All right, so I'm going to call that free stuff socialism. And then the question will be, how appealing is that one in the younger demographic? All right, number 4 is going to be a robust communalism, right? Maybe socialism has a bad name, but if you call it communitarianism or communalism, and you advocate a very strong or robust version of it, then I find that appealing. So the idea here is that I think of human beings as social animals. Our connections and our relationships with other people are what define us and bring the most joy and sense of humanity to our lives. I like families. I like, perhaps if I'm religious, I like my religious community. I like the communal ethos of being a sports fan, in a sense that everyone in my city is pulling together. So I like the idea perhaps of thinking of society as a family writ large, or as a neighborhood writ large. We're all in it together, and it's not just about the money, but it's about working together, and it's about enjoying symphony and music and fairs and community activities together, and perhaps enjoying religious activities together as a group. Now, maybe a generation or two ago, right back in the 60s and 70s, I would have been the kind of person who dropped out of corporate society or bourgeois suburban society and joined a commune. That's the spirit that we're going for, but perhaps lose the hippie overtones. Can we really have a strong sense of community and expand that to all of society? And rather than seeing people as lonely, atomistic individuals who are lost and who are thinking about themselves primarily and so forth, let's take the community spirit and really go for it. And so I'm going to call this one communal socialism. And that's the 5th one. All right, what does socialism mean to me, and what is its appeal? Well, what socialism means is being about the poor and the weak, but not necessarily to the point of sacrifice. I'm not necessarily going to become a missionary, right, or a welfare worker or dedicate myself to the poor, but I do think that we all, as part of a society, have an obligation to look after the poor and the weak. And I think, particularly in a society as rich as ours, that we should prioritize for the foreseeable future the needs of the weak and the poor. The rich and the poor, I don't necessarily hate them. I don't despise them. It's fine and so forth, but it's not going to hurt them that much. The rich and the comfortable, they can certainly trim back on all of the luxuries that they are going. So socialism means prioritizing as a public matter, as a government matter, the problems of the poor and the weak and solving those first. So I'm going to call this welfare state socialism. So socialism is about the usual concerns of welfare programs. All right, 7th, what socialism means to me is a kind of economic management or a resource management, but primarily with a focus on the environment, on preserving the environment and cleaning up the environment. I might approach this negatively by thinking that capitalism is rapacious. Capitalism is about cutting all the trees down. It's about strip mining, and it's about making all sorts of goods for consumers with wasteful packaging and lots of waste byproducts that, just end up in the oceans and filling up the landmines and lots of pollution in the air. And socialism is a corrective to that. So socialism means that we're going to have wise government management of resources to make sure that we are using resources in a sustainable way. It's not just all growth, 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 and profit, profit, profit for the sake of profit. And also the government is going to oversee waste disposal and making sure that garbage and pollution are controlled. So it's wise management of the economy for environmental reasons. So I'm going to call this environmentalist socialism. And eighth in my list, I'm going to say that maybe we're overthinking what socialism means to younger people. In the above ones, we've been trying to come up with kind of rational, explicit arguments and principled and big pictured views that maybe we shouldn't overthink it and kind of think of it as a rationalistic commitment, but rather that what socialism means to me is more of an emotional commitment. And maybe there's a little bit of fear about economic poverty and what might happen to me. Maybe there's a little bit of guilt about my knowing that I'm actually comfortable by international standards, or actually very rich by international standards, or that I'm from a middle class or a prosperous family, and I'm aware that I kind of lucked out, and there's lots of people who are still struggling to make ends meet and living in poverty. And I feel a little bit of guilt about that. Or maybe I feel that I haven't really had a chance in life, that other people had all of these advantages, and so I'm kind of resentful at society, and maybe a little bit resentful of my parents about not having provided me with the opportunities that other people seem to have. I'm aware that while I'm maybe living in my crummy apartment and driving a crummy car, or I don't even have a car right now, there are people who have 3, 4, or 5 beautiful cars, and they're living in gorgeous homes, and they've got all these nice clothes and so forth. And I'm kind of envious of them. And then at the same time, I'm aware that all these people are poor and they're struggling, and my heart goes out to them. And so it's not any one thing, but rather what it is this mix of a little bit of fear and guilt and resentment and envy and compassion, and all of that is going on inside me. And I haven't put it together in terms of any sort of explicit theory, but I know that something's wrong. And what socialism does is it offers me a kind of emotionalist, an emotional salve for the disquiet and the anxieties that I am feeling, right? Because it says I'm going to be looked after. It says other people are going to be looked after. It says that the rich people are going to be brought down a little bit, and that maybe my envy has some justification to it, and so forth. And I'm not going to think it through too far, but it pushes my buttons emotionally, and it makes me feel that that is a better way to approach whatever the problems are right now. So I'm going to call this the eighth and final one on my list, emotionalist socialism. All right. Now, I'm going to wrap things up for today in a couple of minutes here, but what I would like to do is leave you with a couple of wrap-up questions, and we'll follow up on this with my answers to these questions. So far, what we've done is I've asked 2 questions. What does socialism mean to you? What's your operative definition or description if you're a young socialist? What's your answer to that? Second, I asked, what is the value of socialism, or what's the appeal or the attraction of socialism, if you can articulate that. Then I've run through 8 arguments, and I'll just give the names once more. Anti-cronyist socialism, altruistic socialism, central planning socialism, free stuff socialism, communal socialism, welfare state socialism, environmentalist socialism, and emotionalist socialism. A follow-up question then is going to be, are there other kinds of socialism that I have not included on that list of 8, but that you think young people who think of themselves as socialists are attracted to socialism for that reason? Is there a 9th one or a 10th one that I have overlooked that you think should be added to that list? So it's a completeness question. Then the last thing I would like to leave you with is if you could go over the 8 and prioritize them, not necessarily all 8 in all the way down, but of the 8, select what do you think are, say, the top 3. Which ones are the ones that resonate the most with the most number of young socialists? All right, I'm going to stop there for today. And on the next episode of Open College Podcast, we'll talk about socialism for young people. And I will identify the 3 that I think are the most important of those 8. And then I will go on to say, if that is the case, what do I think is a more effective argumentative strategy, a rhetorical response to young people who have come to socialism for those 3 reasons.
The host of the Open College Podcast, Dr. Stephen Hicks, is a renowned philosopher and author. His field of study and insights into postmodernism explain how it has become one of the most powerful intellectual movements of our time, and what that actually means. If you'd like to access more information from Dr. Hicks himself, then check out his website at www.stephenhicks.org. You'll be able to find details on his latest publications, courses, and philosophical information concerning business ethics, education, intellectual history, and religion. To stay up to date with the latest from Stephen Hicks himself, make sure you've subscribed to the Open College Podcast feed and follow at Open College Podcast on all your favourite social networks. And while you're online, please leave the show a review on iTunes and Stitcher.